Well, thank you very much, and it's lovely to be here in one of the homes of a new kind of democracy for Britain. I know quite a bit about that because I happened to share a platform with Pippa at a Compass conference in London a few months ago. So when she said, come down and talk to a women's group, how could I possibly refuse? And she said that feminism is kind of my first politics, and that goes back a very long way. It actually goes back to when I was 5. At the age of 5, I was told, because you're a girl, you're not allowed to have a bicycle. And I've been a feminist ever since. And one of the other things, and Pippa's already told you about sort of some of my background about the ag science degree, and you know where the accent comes from as in Australia. You put those two things together, and one of the things that the British media has been most interested in about me is the fact that I'm probably the only British political leader who knows how to shear a sheep. The fact that that's attracted such interest probably tells you more about the British media than it does about me, actually. But I'm talking tonight about the political alternatives, and it's a really exciting time to be doing that, because we really are, you can feel it in the air, that change is in the air, and that's not before time. And I think one of the things that you might have seen and heard about is what's known as the Green Surge. Yes, that is the hashtag. And the Green Party, if you look at the graph of our membership, it's basically just taken off almost vertically. In fact, we passed 29,000 members on Tuesday morning, and we put the last 2,000 members on in 11 days. And it's not just us. You look at what's happened in Scotland with the SNP, and their membership has quadrupled since the referendum started. There really is political change in the air. And one of the things I think that is really becoming more and more clear to people is the 2015 election is going to be very, very different to the 2010 election was. And I think if you think about the state of Britain, it's quite clear why that is. Because in 2010, when you knocked on doors, when you talked to people, they mightn't have always worked it out. But basically people thought in 2010, oh, we've had a financial crash. We know that capitalism has financial crashes. We think things will, things will be bad for a year or two, but then we'll go back on the same trajectory we were on before, go back to about the start of 2007 and continue on. And yet I don't think there's very many people in Britain who really believe that that's where we are now. It's very clear that our current models are broken. We've got the economic crisis. The fact, and who'd have thought it in 2007, 2008, that still in 2014 we'd be talking about we've got to deal with this problem of the too big to fail banks. We're still talking about that now. The Bank for International Settlements, a couple of months ago, actually said we're closer to a financial crash now than we were in 2007. And then we've got the social crisis, the fact that 1 million people went to food banks last year. And we've actually got a situation where 22% of workers are on less than a living wage. The economy simply isn't delivering for people. And then, of course, we've got the environmental crisis. And with the talks going on in Lima at the moment and climate change in the news, I don't think I need to tell anyone in this room much about that. But if we think about this so much more than that, and one of the figures that I think needs a lot more publicity in talking about is the WWF figures that came out a few weeks ago. See, in the last 40 years, that's less than my lifetime, I'm 48, in the last 40 years, we have lost 50% of the world's vertebrate wildlife. We have half the number of animals in the world that we had 40 years ago. And I think when people think about that, they tend to think of, tigers and whales and big exotic creatures from far away. But one of the figures that we really, really need to think about in places here, the rural areas around, is hedgehogs. That lovely, iconic, I was almost going to say cuddly, but that's not quite right. But you know what I mean. We all like to have them snuffling around in the back garden. Hedgehog numbers. In the last decade, every year, year on year, their numbers are down 38%. Year on year. That's faster than tigers are declining in the wild. And if you think about it, maybe think about it when if you're driving home tonight, you almost never see a hedgehog squashed on the road anymore. And that's actually a really bad thing, somewhat counterintuitively. So we've got all of these crises, and they're all connected. They're all from our system, whether you want to call it hyper-capitalism, whether in terms of politics you want to think about it as neoliberalism, neo-Thatcherism, if you like. And behind this was the philosophy that's really dominated our politics ever since the rise of Margaret Thatcher. The philosophy that greed is good, the resources of the planet are infinite somehow, in ways that don't make sense as soon as you start to think about it, and that we can keep letting the rich getting richer and everyone else can just, the rising tide lifts all boats. And that's a political philosophy that's really clearly failed, even in its own terms. And it's worth thinking and really having a thought about what the nature of political change, because I think in the Green Party, like lots of people, traditionally we've sort of thought, based on long years of hard experience, that you work really, really hard and after a big slog you elect your first councillor, and then a couple of years later you elect your second councillor, and 10 years' time you've made it somewhere. But actually most political change doesn't happen like that. Most political change happens in big sudden leaps. And I take the theory of this from biology and evolution. For anyone who's heard the phrase punctuated equilibrium, it means things stay the same for quite a long while and then they change very suddenly. And I think, of course, here in Frome, I kind of don't need to tell you this in a way, because you've got a perfect example of what happened to your town council elections. Suddenly everything changed in a period of only a few months. And of course the other example we have from this is from Scotland quite recently. And I was up in Scotland about 10 days before the referendum, and it really was absolutely amazing. You read about strangers, British strangers at bus stops talking about politics. And I went door knocking just for a couple of hours in a pretty poor bit of Edinburgh, Leith for anyone who knows Edinburgh. And in 2 hours of door knocking, I only found one non-voter. And in most elections that I've been in sort of comparable poor areas of London, in 2 hours, if you found one committed voter, you thought you were doing really well. People got engaged. They thought, my vote can really make a difference. And so they actually did, because it's true to say that despite all that excitement, in the end it was a no vote. But actually it didn't really matter in a way, because simply by threatening to vote yes, the Scottish people got the promise, we'll see about whether they get the reality, but got the promise of Devo Max, simply because they were threatening to vote yes. And it is actually really quite remarkable when you think about it. 45% of Scots voted against the entire massed ranks of the establishment. All of the largest political parties going, vote no, vote no. The banks, the big companies, the oil companies, all going, vote no, vote no, vote no. And still 45% of people voted yes. And that was a pretty amazing outcome when you think about it. And of course the other thing was that level of engagement. 97% of eligible people enrolled to vote, 85% of them voting. And if we're thinking about an alternative politics, what I'd invite you to imagine, and it requires imagination now, but to imagine what might be possible next May across the whole of Britain. Imagine a general election with an 85% turnout. The usual standard in general elections has been 60-65%, and we've seen a particularly low turnout among particularly younger people. But imagine an election next May with an 85% turnout. And imagine that pretty well has to mean that the under 25s are voting at the same kind of levels as the over 60s do as standard. And then imagine an election where people think about voting in a different kind of way. Because all of us have collectively been trained by the first past the post system to think about elections in a particular kind of way. We've been trained to think you have to vote for the person or party you dislike second most, to stop the people you really hate getting in. But it is really worth thinking about that is actually what's given us the kind of politics we actually have now. It's encouraged parties to chase after the swing voters in the swing seats, to absolutely ignore their core, ignore any sense of principles, just say, what does the focus group about the swing voters in the swing seats say, and we've got to say that. And if we're going to change politics, one of the ways in which we can change politics is actually to vote in a different kind of way. Now, I'll admit to some self-interest in this suggestion that you should actually vote for what you believe in rather than vote like it's a two-horse race, because there's a website called Vote for Policies. Some of you might know it. It was based on the 2010 general election manifestos, but there will also be one for 2015. They did a crowdfunder happily and got the money to do a 2015 one. And what this did very simply was it said, here's all the policies for the parties with the branding stripped out. What do you think is the best policy on education? What do you think is the best policy on defence, etc., etc.? And this is where I admit the self-interest comes in, because about 500,000 people have filled in that survey, and the Green Party, last I looked at it, was running on about 25% and winning. And I'll take that for 2015. But it's interesting because actually there was a YouGov poll a couple of weeks ago which actually produced a remarkably similar result. It asked people, if you think they could win, just imagine whatever your favourite party is, if you think that they could win, who would you vote for? And again, the Green Party scored 26% nationally. So we've got an interesting challenge. We can win if it looks like we can win. And that's quite a challenge. But I think really the key message that I've got here in terms of what we can have as an alternative politics, and this is a great place to be having it, because here in Frome you've actually already done it. You got presented with an idea of something different, a different way of doing politics, a different way of doing these things. And of course you elected an independent town council. And it's interesting actually, because lots of the media has been lately focusing on how well the Green Party is doing in the southwest. It was great that we elected Molly Scott-Cato as our first Green MEP here in the southwest. And they're saying that the southwest is different. They mean that nicely, I promise. And what they're saying is that you're kind of independent-minded, prepared to look at things a bit differently. And of course there's another example of that, not very far from here in Bristol, where Bristol elected an independent mayor, something that, and Ken Livingstone was a bit of a special case, something that most of Britain has never actually done. And so it's worth really thinking about this. The future, the political future, is actually in your hands as voters. If voters collectively decide, first of all, and this is a really important message that I hope that you particularly take away and make sure you spread widely, make sure you register to vote, because they've changed the method of registration of voters. And this is really going to be a particular issue, particularly for younger voters, particularly people living in student residences. Every individual has to register to vote. It's no longer the head of the household that registers everybody. So make sure you're registered to vote, and make sure that everyone you know knows they've got to register to vote. And that's a really important message, because I think one of the things that there's a real risk of seeing, if, as we saw in Scotland, there's a late dash of excitement, and lots of people, quite in the last week or two go, yeah, I haven't voted for decades, but I'm going to vote this time. There's a real risk that a lot of them can turn up at the polling station and find that they're not registered to vote and they can't vote. And that's something that could be really damaging for British democracy. So it's a really important message. This is not a party political message. It's a message to get out to everybody through every mechanism we can. Make sure you're registered to vote so you can have your say. And then when I get to the more party political bit, to say that vote quite simply for what you believe in. Look at your local campaign, look at the person, party, policies that most match your views, and vote for that. And, we're heading into very interesting times. There is, I think you could say, something good about the rise of UKIP. Yes, I did just say that. That it's actually thrown seats wide open. There's a seat up on the Wirral and up in the northwest where we had, a couple of years ago, a Green Party candidate got 42% of the vote in the council election and wasn't elected, because Labor got 45% and the other percentages were spread between Lib Dem and Tory. But UKIP came along and that one-party state ended and the Green got elected because UKIP took enough votes off Labor to let the Green through. So we're actually getting to the point where there is almost not going to be hardly any safe seats left. And that is a really good thing for British democracy. But there's also really the potential that lots of people could be elected with 25% of the vote, or not much more, which is where we get to the potentially other exciting outcome from this election, which is the fact that we all know that first past the post is a disastrously bad system that's helped to get us where we are now. And we all know that we need change. And perhaps there were quite a few people in this room who did what I did, which was during the AV referendum, stand on doorsteps and go, well, you should vote yes. Yes, AV isn't very good, but it's a bit better than what we've got now, which unsurprisingly didn't win the referendum. But that's left us in a situation now where if you look at Westminster, we haven't reformed Westminster in nearly 100 years. The last big change in Westminster was women getting the vote, and that was 1918. So it's a very good point to say let's not get to the century anniversary of that without having changed anything since. And what we're calling for in the Green Party is for a People's Constitutional Convention. It's basically too late to tinker with a century-old unreformed system. We say we need to start again, and obviously we've got lots of ideas about what we think that should look like, and an elected House of Lords, not in the 21st century, something that's a product of patronage and accidents of birth. We think that we should also have proportional representation in the lower house. But what we're actually saying is rather than us offering a recipe, what we should do instead is have a People's Constitutional Convention, select people at random from all around the country so that they represent the people of Britain. Could be someone in this room who gets to go on that convention, give them the resources, the experts, the knowledge that they need, and say, draw us up a new constitution. Start from scratch. And one of the other things that I think we can see the real force coming through on in terms of changing politics is that that constitution should start from the local. Power and resources and money should rest locally, in local communities, and only be referred upward in the way that it needs to be. So rather than everything being centralised on Westminster, centralised on London, as much power and decision-making as possible should be local. And the total reverse of what we're seeing now, where local councils are seeing their funding slashed and slashed away. The money to fulfil those local responsibilities should stay local. So that's some thoughts to start the evening, to start the discussion about an alternative kind of politics. And I think, it's great to see this is another sign of alternative politics, this turnout on a Saturday night when I'm told there's all kind of bands and things I'm competing with this evening in Frome. People are hungry for change, for real change. Tinkering around the edges, playing with what we've got with some, little change here and a little change there simply isn't going to do anymore. We've got those three crises, the economic, the social and political, and we've got the environmental crisis too. All of those crises are there, and it's actually in our hands to do something about it. And it really is a responsibility for all of us to do something about it. Because one of the things I talk to is a lot of particularly school groups, sixth forms, university groups. And I say to them, from my generation to your generation, I'm sorry, we've made a right mess of this. That's the state we're giving you the world. But what we can all do is get together, cooperate, and build something better. And I've got two suggestions of what the new political philosophy needs to be to replace Thatcherism, neoliberalism, whatever you like. I think there's two things we need to say. First of all, we should say that everybody should have access to the resources for a decent quality of life. Nobody should live in fear. Nobody should have to go to a food bank, should think, how am I going to keep a roof over my head next week? Everyone should have enough. But we all of us collectively have to do that within the limits of one planet, because that's the only planet that we've got. So that's my suggestion for the content of a new alternative kind of politics, and my suggestion of how we do it simply by voting. I look forward to the discussion. Thank you.